The woman in the witness chair smoothed her blazer with both hands before she spoke. It was a small gesture, barely worth noticing. But the attorney for the opposing side noticed it, and the judge noticed it, and every single person in that Charleston, South Carolina courtroom noticed it, because the woman about to speak was Vivienne Ashford, CEO of Ashford Meridian Estates, and Vivienne Ashford did not smooth her blazer. She did not show nerves. She did not adjust anything in front of anyone. The fact that she was smoothing her blazer now meant something had already broken. Ms. Ashford, her own attorney, said quietly from the defense table, "Are you ready?" She didn't answer. She was looking at a man seated across the courtroom. A black man in a dark jacket, broad-shouldered, completely still, his hands flat on the table in front of him. He wasn't looking back at her. He was looking at the window, like he had somewhere better to be. The attorney for his side leaned in and whispered something, and the man nodded, once slowly, the way someone nods when they've already known the answer for a long time. Vivienne Ashford looked at that man and smoothed her blazer again. If you want to understand how we got to this courtroom, you have to go back 7 months. Back to a Tuesday morning in late March, to a man named Denzel Washington, and to a writing desk that started everything. Denzel Washington was 54 years old and had been fixing things his entire life, not because it was all he could do, because it was the only kind of work that still made sense to him. He ran a small architectural restoration company out of a converted garage in Summerville, South Carolina, about 30 minutes north of Charleston. The business was called Cornerstone Heritage Works. It had 4 employees, a white panel van with 1 dent above the rear wheel well, and a reputation that had traveled quietly through the preservation community for 11 years. He was a big man, broad through the chest, with hands that looked like they belonged to someone who had spent decades doing exactly what he had spent decades doing. He kept his gray-flecked hair close-cut and his work clothes clean even on job sites. He drove a truck that was 9 years old and saw no particular reason to replace it. There was a small photograph tucked into the sun visor above the driver's seat. He had never moved it or explained it to anyone. Most mornings, he was at his garage by 6. He made coffee in a machine that had stopped working correctly 2 years ago and that he kept fixing rather than replacing, partly because he was good at it and partly because it seemed wasteful to throw away something that still had useful life. He checked in with his nephew Darnell, who was 23, and had come to live with Denzel 3 years ago after Denzel's younger sister Patricia passed from a stroke that nobody saw coming. Darnell had been 2 semesters into community college when Patricia died. He had stopped going. Denzel had not pushed him back. He had simply let Darnell work alongside him on job sites until the boy found his footing again. That particular Tuesday morning, Denzel had been hired to assess an antique writing desk at a private estate on Hayward Point Road, just outside the city limits of Charleston. The property was called Ashford House. It was the kind of house that had a name on a stone post at the end of the driveway. 3 acres of live oaks, a main house built in 1887, a carriage house that had been converted to guest quarters, and a view of the Wando River that made everything else on the property seem almost incidental. The desk had belonged to the late Harland Ashford, patriarch of the Ashford family and founder of Ashford Meridian Estates, a real estate and hospitality company that currently managed 19 properties across 5 states. Harland had died 4 months earlier. His daughter Vivienne had inherited control of the company, the house, and apparently a desk that needed professional attention. Denzel arrived at 8:47 in the morning. He brought Darnell. The front door was answered by a housekeeper named Clara, a woman in her 60s with a warm, unhurried manner who showed them through to a study at the back of the house without ceremony. The desk was a Federal period mahogany secretary, circa 1815, roll-top timbre shutters, brass fittings on the drawers, inlaid satin Fisher banding along the front panels. It had been used. The leather surface was cracked in a way that told a story of daily use rather than neglect. One of the timbre slats had warped loose. A brass fitting on the lower right drawer was hanging from a single screw. Denzel crouched in front of it for a long time without touching anything. Darnell stood in the corner with a notebook, waiting. "What are we thinking?" Darnell said. "Not yet," Denzel said. He looked at it the way a doctor looks before they decide anything. He held his flashlight to the underside of the roll-top housing. He pressed 2 fingers gently along the tambour rail. He opened the lower drawer and examined where the wood had swelled and shrunk over 2 centuries of South Carolina summers. He was still looking when the door opened. Vivienne Ashford was 41 years old, dressed for an office she was not currently in a gray suit that probably cost more than Denzel's truck. She was white, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled back in a way that communicated she had thought about it for exactly as long as she needed to and not 1 second more. She had the particular kind of confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from having been right so consistently for so long that she'd stopped checking. She took in the 2 men in her father's study with one brief, encompassing glance. "You're from the restoration company," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Denzel stood. She looked at the desk. Then she looked at Denzel, then at Darnell, then back at the desk. "Can it be fixed?" "Yes." "How long?" "3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on where I source the replacement timber slat. There are 2 suppliers I use. One is faster, one is better. They're not the same supplier." Vivienne almost smiled. "Not quite. Use the better one." She started to leave, then stopped in the doorway, the brass fitting on the lower drawer. "My father kept that drawer locked. The key went missing some time before he passed. I'd like the lock replaced, not removed." "I can do that." She nodded, already half out the door. "Clara will give you whatever access you need." She was gone before Denzel had picked his flashlight back up. Darnell watched the empty doorway. "She's something. She's a client," Denzel said. "Write down timber slat, federal period, mahogany, 11/16 inch, and we'll figure out the rest at the shop." He went back to studying the desk. What Denzel did not know, and what would matter enormously later, was that Vivienne Ashford had not slept properly in 4 months. Since her father died, she had been managing an inheritance that included not only the company but Harland Ashford's long list of unfinished business, including a deathbed concern that had kept the old man agitated through his final weeks. He had been afraid, he told Vivienne, that she was going to end up alone, not lonely in the way you're lonely at a party where you don't know anyone. Alone in the permanent final sense, no one to sit with her at the end of the day, no one to notice when she was tired. Harland Ashford had been many things. He had been a hard businessman and an exacting father, and a man who had built something from nothing and was prouder of it than was probably healthy. He had also loved his daughter with a ferocity that had occasionally embarrassed both of them. And in his last weeks, that love had narrowed to a single point of worry that he could not put down. Vivienne had been trying to put down that worry on his behalf ever since. She was not, by any external measure, alone. She ran a company with 237 employees. She had a full calendar and a phone that never stopped. She had friends in the city, acquaintances in 4 other states, and a social presence that was curated, managed, and largely hollow. What she did not have was what Harland had described, the particular thing she'd never learned to want because wanting it seemed like too much risk. Someone who saw her. Not the company, not the position. The desk took 3 weeks. Denzel made 4 visits to Ashford House over that period. On the first visit, he worked alone. On the second, he brought Darnell and 1 other member of his team, a woman named Brooke who specialized in leather conservation. Vivienne appeared briefly on the second visit, asked 1 question about the tambour slats, received a clear answer, and left. On the third visit, she stayed longer. She stood in the doorway of the study watching Denzel work, not hovering. Just present, the way someone stands in a room when they're not quite ready to leave it. "You know what that desk was used for?" she said eventually. "Writing," Denzel said without looking up. "Letters, most likely. The leather's worn more in the center than at the edges. Someone sat in one place and wrote regularly. Not accounting work. Accounting work wears out the right side where you rest your forearm. This is even wear. Personal correspondence. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. "My father wrote letters to my mother for 43 years. Even after she passed, he kept writing them." She paused. "I found them in the locked drawer after he died. That's when I noticed the lock was broken." Denzel set down his tool. He turned and looked at her directly for the first time during that visit. She was standing with her arms crossed, not defensively the way someone stands when they are cold. Her expression was not the one she wore for business. It was quieter, less arranged. "I'm sorry about your father." Denzel said. She nodded, looked at the desk. He was difficult. Most people worth missing are. She looked at him then with the expression of someone who has just heard a thing that is too true to acknowledge gracefully. She excused herself and didn't come back that day. The fourth visit was when everything changed, although it didn't announce itself as such. Denzel arrived early to finish the final finishing work, the wax on the mahogany, the polishing of the brass fittings, the new lock set correctly in the lower drawer. Clara brought him coffee without being asked. Darnell was with him, quieter than usual. Darnell had a phone call scheduled that morning that he was dreading. The call was from a social services coordinator in Columbia. It had to do with a custody arrangement involving Darnell's younger half-brother, 19-year-old Trayvon, who had aged out of the foster system at 18 and had spent the subsequent year making a sequence of decisions that had compounded badly. There was a hearing scheduled, there was a family assessment required. Darnell did not want to go alone. He had asked Denzel to be there. Vivienne found Denzel in the study just after 11. She stopped in the doorway when she saw his face, not the expression he wore for clients. Something underneath it. Something that had pushed through without his permission, Mr. Washington. "Give me 1 second," he said quietly. He closed his eyes, opened them. The expression was gone, or almost gone. "I apologize. The desk is finished. I'd like you to see the lock mechanism before I pack up." She didn't move toward the desk. "What's wrong?" "Nothing that's your concern." "I didn't ask whose concern it was. I asked what was wrong." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said briefly, without excess, about Darnell and Patricia and the hearing in Columbia and the boy who had no one else to show up for him. Vivienne listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked one question: "When is the hearing? Thursday?" She nodded slowly. Then she said something unexpected. "My father's company is negotiating a settlement with a contractor in Columbia right now. I have a meeting there on Thursday morning." She paused. "I could drive if that would be useful." Denzel looked at her. "Miss Ashford," he said carefully, "you don't have to do that." "I'm aware." She turned to look at the desk. The mahogany was deep and warm, the brass fittings pushed back usefulness. "It looks exactly like it should have looked," she said softly. "Like it's been well cared for. Thank you." She left the room before he could respond. She drove them to Columbia on Thursday. The hearing went badly. The coordinator was skeptical of Denzel's role, questioned his relationship to Trayvon, questioned the stability of his home situation, questioned everything with the specific professional skepticism of someone who has been this dim long enough to have lost the ability to see clearly. Vivienne sat 3 rows back in the gallery and watched. She did not intervene. She simply watched. On the drive back, Darnell sat in the back seat and stared out the window. Denzel sat in the front, not speaking. Vivienne drove in silence for 11 miles. Then she said, without looking away from the highway, "I can refer you to an attorney. Family law, she's in Charleston. She owes me a conversation." Denzel turned to look at her profile. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because the coordinator was wrong," Vivienne said. "And I don't like watching people be wrong about things I can see clearly. She said it the way you say a thing when you mean it, and you're slightly irritated that it needs to be said at all." Denzel faced forward. Somewhere past the tree line, the sky was going orange over the highway. He didn't answer, but something in his hands, flat on his knees, went still in a way that was different from the careful stillness of before. What happened next happened slowly. That is the only honest way to describe it. Vivienne arranged the attorney referral. Denzel took the meeting. The attorney, a sharp, dry-humored woman named Patrice, identified 3 procedural errors in the original hearing and filed a motion to delay and reassess. It was not a guaranteed outcome, but it was a real one. During that period, Vivienne found reasons to reach out. Not elaborate reasons, small ones. A question about a second piece of furniture in the main house she was considering having restored. A recommendation she needed for a craftsman in Savannah for a separate project. A coffee that was technically a client meeting and was, in practice, not a client meeting. Denzel did not pretend otherwise. He showed up. He was direct in the way he was always direct, not unkind, not soft, just clear. He said what he meant and waited for her to say what she meant. When she circled around things, he waited. When she said something true, he acknowledged it without making it a production. He told her once over coffee at a diner on King Street that some things got more valuable from being used rather than preserved untouched. He was talking about a technique for stabilizing old wood. She heard something else. She did not say so. She was very good at not saying things. The trouble started at the Ashford Meridian board meeting in April. Vivienne had inherited a company that came with its own architecture of power, including a board of directors that had been loyal to Harland rather than to any principle she could identify. The chair of that board was a man named Randall Pruitt, 63 years old, silver-haired, with the particular brand of old money Southern ease that made every conversation feel like a negotiation you hadn't realized you'd entered. Randall had been Harland's college roommate. He had served on the board for 19 years. He had opinions about everything and shared most of them. At the April meeting, Vivienne mentioned that she was considering commissioning a full heritage assessment of the Ashford House property, something her father had spoken about but never executed. The work would be contracted to a small local firm with a strong preservation track record. Randall leaned back in his chair. Which firm? Cornerstone Heritage Works. Out of Somerville. I'm not familiar with them, they're not large. But the work on the desk was exceptional, and they have a specific competency in federal period structures. Randall smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Vivienne, this is a significant contract. The Ashford House is the company's flagship property. I'd feel more comfortable if we opened it up to formal bids. Bring in some of the established preservation houses, Hammond Restorations, Patterson Historical, firms that have done this scale of work. I have assessed the work. I don't need a formal bid to know the quality. Nevertheless, he folded his hands. It's optics, Vivienne. You've been leading this company for 4 months. The board needs to see rigorous process, especially on contracts of this size. He let a beat pass, and frankly, I think it would be prudent to ensure that whoever is working on this property doesn't have any other relationship with the family that might complicate the professional arrangement. The room went quiet in a particular way. Not because anyone was shocked, because everyone understood what had just been said, and no one was going to be the one to call it what it was. Vivienne set her pen down on the table, carefully. I'd like to understand what you mean by that, Randall. I simply mean, he said pleasantly, that it's standard practice to maintain clear professional distance. He's a contractor. I've had him to the house 4 times. He restored a desk, of course. Another smile. I only mention it because Clara did say you drove to Columbia with him. And I want to make sure the board's interests are protected. Clara. Vivienne looked at Randall and understood several things simultaneously. That someone had been reporting to him, that this was not a new arrangement, that the conversation she was currently in was not about the desk or the contract. We'll table the heritage assessment discussion for next quarter, she said. Is there other business? She drove home alone that evening. She sat in the kitchen for a long time, the kind of long that isn't about rest, with a glass of wine she didn't finish, looking at nothing in particular. Clara knocked and asked if she needed anything. Vivienne said no. Clara left. What Randall Pruitt had done was not technically a threat. It was a demonstration, a reminder of who had been in the room before her, who knew the company's geography, and who had the patience to wait at a daughter who had inherited something she had not built. The calls started 2 days later, not to Vivienne, to Denzel. The first was from a man identifying himself as a board representative of Ashford Meridian Estates, informing Denzel in a very pleasant tone that the company had decided to open the heritage assessment to a formal competitive bidding process and that Cornerstone Heritage Works was welcome to submit materials. Standard personal. Denzel thanked him and hung up. The second call came the following week, this time from a preservation consultant named Boyd, who had contracts with Hammond Restorations, the firm Randall had named. Boyd mentioned casually that he'd heard Cornerstone had done some work at the Ashford property. He mentioned more carefully that Hammond was very well connected in Charleston. He said it the way people say things they want you to hear without being able to say they said it. Denzel wrote down Boyd's name and the time of the call. The third thing was not a phone call. It was a rumor, and rumors in a city like Charleston travel faster than phone calls. By the end of April, Denzel had heard through two separate professional contacts that questions were being quietly raised about Cornerstone's licensing documentation. No formal complaint, just questions. The kind of questions that, if left to circulate long enough, become facts in the minds of people who don't check their sources. Denzel sat at his workbench that evening for a long time. Darnell came out of the back of the garage and sat on an overturned bucket and didn't say anything. The overhead light buzzed in the quiet. "What are we doing?" Darnell said finally. "I don't know yet," Denzel said. He picked it up, set it down. "Go home, Darnell. I'm good here, I know. Go home anyway," Darnell went. Denzel stayed. He opened the bottom drawer of his workbench, the one that didn't pull smoothly because the wood had swollen years ago and he'd never gotten around to fixing it. He took out a folder. Inside the folder was documentation that had been sitting there for 3 years, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. He hadn't decided. Now looking at it in the buzzing light of his garage, he thought he might be running out of time to keep deferring. What the folder contained was not something he had ever discussed with a client. It was not something he discussed with anyone. It was, in the language of the preservation community, a significant thing. In other languages, it was the kind of thing that changed rooms when it entered them. He put the folder back in the drawer. He would decide in the morning. The conversation with Vivienne happened on a Wednesday evening, is in the kitchen of Ashford House, without planning on either side. Denzel had come to drop off documentation related to a separate small project. Clara let him in. Vivienne was at the kitchen table with her laptop and a plate of food she hadn't touched. She looked up. Something crossed her face. Not the business expression, the underneath one. "Sit down," she said. He did. Clara disappeared. They talked for a long time, not about the board, not about Randall, not at first, about Harlan's letters, which Vivienne had been reading, about Darnell's case, which had a new court date, about what Denzel had said once about things becoming more valuable because of what they'd survived. She said she'd been thinking about that. He told her about the folder in the drawer. She listened without interrupting in a way she had gotten good at. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he could hear the house settle around them, the particular slow sound of an old structure shifting in the evening cool. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because Randall is running a campaign to discredit my company," Denzel said. "And if it gets to a certain point, what's in that folder becomes public information anyway. I'd rather you know from me." She looked at him. Not the way she looked at contractors. Not the way she looked at board members. The way she had looked at the letters in the locked drawer. Like she was reading something slowly because she wanted to get it right. "I've been thinking," she said, "about a different kind of arrangement." He waited. "My father wanted me to not be alone," she said, "and I've been trying to solve that the way I solve everything, by managing it, by constructing the right situation. But the situations I construct are always performances, and I'm tired." She paused. "Darnell's hearing needs a stable family environment on record. Your company needs a client of scale who can speak to your reputation, and I need to stop performing for a board that has already decided who I am." She said it plainly, the way she always said things. Then she said, "I'm suggesting a joint arrangement. 6 months. We present as a partnership, professionally and otherwise. It gives Darnell's case what it needs. It gives Cornerstone a visible anchor client, and it gives me what I told my father I was never going to need." Denzel looked at her for a long time. The kitchen was quiet. The overhead light was warm. Somewhere outside, the river made its own small sound against the bank. "That's an unusual proposal," he said. "I'm aware you understand what you're describing. I understand exactly what I'm describing." He picked up his coffee cup, set it down. "And what about what happens on day 181? Something moved in her face. "I don't know," she said. "I don't usually admit that." He nodded slowly. "Once. I'll think about it," he said. He thought about it for 4 days. He talked to no one. He drove the long way home from job sites, around the back roads west of the Wando, where there were still stretches of nothing but marsh grass and pine. He made his coffee. He fixed the machine again when it stopped. On the 4th day, he called Vivienne. "All right," he said. "All right," she said back. What happened over the following months was not, in the beginning, anything like what either of them had planned. They had planned a performance. What they got was considerably more inconvenient. Denzel moved in over a weekend in May. Darnell helped carry boxes, and Denzel told him only what he needed to know, which was not the whole truth, and which Darnell accepted with the particular grace of a young man who has learned that adults carry things they cannot always explain. Vivienne's household adjusted. Clara did not ask questions, but her expression on the second morning, when she found Denzel in the kitchen making coffee for two, communicated that she had no questions because she had already answered them. They were careful with each other, formally careful the way people are when they are sharing space and trying very hard not to assume. Vivienne worked long hours. Denzel left early and came back late. They ate dinner together most nights because it seemed more absurd not to, and those dinners were, for the first 3 weeks, professionally pleasant. Then Vivienne burned the soup. It was not dramatic. She had been trying to make something she remembered from childhood, a dish her mother used to cook, and she had overseasoned it so aggressively that it was genuinely inedible. She served it anyway, set it on the table, sat down and looked at it. Denzel tasted it, set his spoon down. "That's very bad," he said. She stared at the soup. "I know. How much salt did you put in? I don't want to say." He looked at her, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Something that was the opposite of professional distance. Something quieter and warmer and entirely unguarded. He laughed, not loudly, but genuinely. And she looked at him laughing, and she laughed too, and the kitchen got completely different from what it had been before that moment, and neither of them talked about it afterward, but both of them knew that something had changed. The agreement, as agreed, held. Darnell's case went back to court in June. The attorney Patrice had rebuilt the narrative. Denzel sat in the front row. Vivienne sat beside him. The coordinator, who had been skeptical, looked at the two of them, at the evidence of a stable household, at Patrice's meticulous documentation, and revised the assessment. Trayvon was placed under a guardian arrangement with Denzel as supervising adult. He would not be sent back to a group facility. Darnell cried in the parking lot outside the courthouse. He didn't apologize for it. Denzel put a hand on the back of his neck the way you do with someone you've known since they were still figuring out how to be in the world, and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the hand wasn't already saying. Vivienne stood a few feet back, giving them the moment. Then Darnell looked up and said, "Come here," and pulled her into it, and she let herself be pulled in the way you let yourself be pulled when you've stopped pretending you don't want to be there. Randall Pruitt's campaign continued. In July, he pushed a motion to the board requiring Vivienne to formally recuse herself from any contracts related to Cornerstone Heritage Works on the grounds of a personal conflict of interest. The motion passed, 6 votes to 3. Vivienne was informed by formal letter. She read the letter at her desk and then picked up her phone and called the attorney who handled the company's shareholder documentation. She had 3 questions for him. The call took 11 minutes. What she learned was that the board's articles of governance, written in 1987 and not materially updated since, contained a provision that Harland had included and never had reason to use. A provision that allowed the primary shareholder to call for an independent review of the board's composition and voting conduct in cases of documented conflict of interest. Vivienne was the primary shareholder. Harland had left her 63% of the company outright. She had known this. She had not yet thought carefully about what it meant in practice. She thought about it now. Meanwhile, Denzel learned the full scope of what Randall had been doing. It was more than questions about licensing documentation. Randall's office had contacted 3 of Denzel's former clients with vague inquiries about the quality of past work. They had quietly flagged Cornerstone's name with a Charleston Preservation Committee on which Randall held an advisory position. They had shared, through Boyd the consultant, a suggestion that Denzel's professional profile had been inflated by his relationship with the Ashford family. This was the thing that made Denzel pull out the folder from the drawer. He didn't make a public announcement. He wrote 3 letters, one to the Charleston Preservation Society, one to the South Carolina Historic Preservation Office, one to the editor of a regional architecture journal who had been trying to reach him for 2 years about a feature article he had consistently declined. The letters said nothing dramatic. They stated briefly and completely who he was and what he had done and what documentation existed to support both. He signed them and sent them. The folder he had kept in his workbench drawer for 3 years contained correspondence and technical reports from a project that, in preservation circles, was considered a landmark case. A federal period courthouse in Beaufort County, a restoration that had been formally credited, publicly, to a larger firm because Denzel had done the work as an independent contractor and had not wanted the attention at the time. The lead architect of that project, a nationally recognized figure named Dr. Charles Hensley, had written a letter in 2021 attesting to Denzel's specific and irreplaceable contribution. Denzel had kept the letter in a drawer. Dr. Hensley, reached by phone, was glad to be asked. He was, if in fact, noticeably pleased to have a reason to say publicly what he had been saying privately for years. He gave an interview to the Architecture Journal. He was specific, detailed, and entirely credible. The article ran in late July. It was, by the modest standards of the preservation world, a sensation. By the morning it went live online, Denzel had 11 messages from clients and 4 from institutions he had never spoken to. Vivienne read at her kitchen table before Denzel came down for coffee. She did not say anything when he walked in. She simply turned her laptop to face him. He read it standing, his coffee going cold in his hand. "You knew about this," she said. "I knew what I'd done," he said. "I didn't know what Charles was going to say. He called you the most technically accomplished independent conservator currently working in the Southeast. He's a generous man." She looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that were too true to acknowledge gracefully. "Denzel, he put your name in print, alongside Beaufort. That's not generosity." Denzel put his cold coffee down. "It's still just words." She shook her head slowly. "No," she said, "it isn't. The board meeting in August was the one that ended things. Vivienne had convened it formally with proper notice, with documentation, with the legal representation present that the Articles of Governance permitted in cases of shareholder review. Randall arrived assuming a routine meeting. The composition of the room told him otherwise before anyone said a word. She laid it out without theater. The history of board interference in contracting decisions, the documented campaign against Cornerstone Heritage Works, the formal communications that had been made in the company's name without her authorization, the legal implications of each. Randall leaned forward with the smile he used when he was managing a situation. "Vivienne, I think you're reading bad faith into decisions that were made in the company's interest. The board has a fiduciary duty." "Randall." Her voice was quiet, not raised. "I'm asking you to stop." He stopped. "The board has operated on the assumption that I inherited something I don't fully understand," she said. "I want to be clear that I understand it completely. I understand that you were loyal to my father, and that you believe that loyalty entitled you to a degree of influence over me that my father never intended, and that I am not going to continue to allow." She paused. "I am the majority shareholder of this company. I am the CEO. The Heritage Assessment contract will be awarded to Cornerstone Heritage Works based on merit that has now been publicly documented and independently verified. And I am formally requesting your resignation from this board, effective immediately." The room went still. Randall looked at her for a long moment. The smile was gone. What was underneath it was something older and more honest, a man who had been certain he understood a situation and had been wrong, and who could not quite process the distance between those two states. "You can't be serious," he said. "The documentation is in the folders in front of you. My attorney will be available for any questions." She folded her hands on the table. "The motion requires a majority board vote to enforce. I'd appreciate you saving us all the time and tendering the resignation voluntarily." He did not resign voluntarily. He called the vote. He lost it 5-4, with one abstention from a board member named Gerald, who had watched the whole proceeding with an expression and suggested he knew what he was doing and would carry that knowledge quietly for a long time. Randall Pruitt stood in the parking garage below the office building 40 minutes later with a box of his personal effects. A photographer from a local business journal, tipped by someone who was not in that meeting, captured the moment. Randall looked at the camera with the expression of a man who was still, even now, composing the version of events he would tell later, the version in which he had been right, he had not been right, He would not be able to make anyone believe he had been right. The article in the Architecture Journal, the documentation from the Beaufort Courthouse project, the board vote, and the attorney's formal letter to the Preservation Committee would collectively ensure that whatever Randall Pruitt said about Denzel Washington or Cornerstone Heritage Works or Vivienne Ashford from this point forward would be evaluated in that light. He drove home alone and sat in a house that had been telling him who he was for so long that he no longer knew how to hear anything else. It was the quietest form of reckoning, the kind that lands completely and has nowhere to go. Boyd, the consultant, called Zell 2 days later to apologize. He was not entirely coherent. Denzel listened for long enough to understand that Boyd was primarily apologizing to himself and then thanked him for calling. The custody arrangement for Trayvon was finalized in September. He moved into a room at Denzel's garage apartment in Somerville. The first week, he barely spoke. The second week, he helped Darnell on a job site without being asked. By October, Denzel had overheard him asking Darnell questions about the work. Good questions, the kind that suggest a mind that has been dormant and is waking up. The evening Vivienne came to the garage apartment. For the first time, she brought nothing. No reason, she simply appeared at the door and said I was driving past. Denzel let her in. The apartment was clean and spare. Tools organized on a peg wall. A bookshelf with more books than the space seemed to call for. The photograph from the truck visor sat in a frame on the windowsill. She did not ask about it. She looked at it once and looked away. They sat on the back step with 2 coffees and the sound of the marsh moving in the dark. The 6 months are up in 2 weeks, she said. I know. She held her cup in both hands. I've been thinking about what I said the night I proposed this. About constructing situations. He waited. I'm not constructing this, she said. I want you to know that. I'm not performing for anyone. There's no one watching. He looked out at the marsh. A night heron moved somewhere in the reeds, unhurried. I know, he said. She turned to look at him. Denzel, I know, he said again. This time he looked back. She set her cup down on the step beside her. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. Not as a gesture for anyone watching. There was no one watching. There was no contract. There was just the marsh and the dark and 2 people who had been careful with each other for 6 months and had run out of reasons to keep being careful. Okay, he said. The heritage assessment of Ashford House was completed in the spring. Cornerstone Heritage Works produced a 63-page report that the South Carolina Historic Preservation Office requested permission to use as a model document for future assessments of federal period private properties. Denzel said yes. He let Darnell's name up on the report as junior assessor. Darnell read his name on the cover page and stood in the office doorway for a long time without speaking. Then he went back to work. The writing desk stood in Harland Ashford's study, fully restored. The timbre shutters moved smoothly. The brass fittings were polished back to usefulness. The lower drawer locked and unlocked correctly, with a new key that Vivienne kept on a ring with her house keys. She had not yet opened the drawer again. She wasn't sure she needed to. What her father had written in those letters was between him and her mother, and she thought that was exactly where it should stay. There was a night in late October when Denzel sat on the back porch of Ashford House, looking at the Wando River in the dark. Vivienne had gone inside to take a call. He had his coffee. The river did its quiet thing. He thought about his sister Patricia, and about the photograph in the truck visor, and about the fact that grief does not resolve, it only changes shape, and that the shape it had taken in him lately was something he could live inside rather than something that lived inside him. His phone sat on the arm of the chair. There was a name in his contacts he had not called in 7 years. A college friend who had gone in a direction he'd lost track of. He looked at the name for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket. Vivienne came back out. Sorry, she said, Patrice, about the custody documentation. Everything all right? Everything's good. She sat down. The river, the dark. The string of lights Clara had hung in the oak tree at the edge of the yard, because she felt the yard needed lights and nobody had disagreed. Some things, it turns out, don't require explanation. They only require time and the willingness to stay. Denzel once said that the things worth restoring are the ones that have been used, not the ones kept under glass. He meant wood. He meant brass. He meant the particular physics of old structures that have absorbed decades of weight and climate and human presence and are stronger for it, not weaker. He was also, and this took him longer to understand, talking about people, the things that have been used, the things that show their history, the things that look worn to people who don't know what they're seeing, and look irreplaceable to people who do. Vivienne Ashford had spent 41 years building something immaculate, something without cracks, something that could not be questioned or diminished. It had protected her, and it had cost her, and she had not known the cost until a man crouched next to a desk and told her that sanding down the scratches makes the thing look newer, but means it doesn't know anything anymore. She knew now, not everything, not even most things, but she knew that the life her father was afraid she'd miss had not looked the way she'd expected. It had arrived slowly and specifically, in the form of a man who drove an old truck and fixed things other people had written off and kept a photograph he never explained, and who had, in the particular way of people who are completely secure in who they are, made her feel like herself without asking her to perform it. If you've ever been underestimated, you already understand this story. If you've ever been in a room where someone looked through you rather than at you, you know the specific weight of that, the way it settles in your chest, the way it asks you to question what you know to be true. And if you've ever watched a person hold that weight quietly, without losing anything essential, without needing to explain themselves or prove themselves or wait for permission from anyone, then you know what this story is really about. It isn't about the contract, it isn't about the board, or the desk, or the courtroom. It's about the fact that some things have been here the whole time, doing the work, building what lasts, in spaces where no one thought to look. And the people who don't see that don't lose their chance to know it. They lose something worse. They lose the chance to be changed by it. Dignity is not something you grant. It is something you either recognize or you miss. And missing it always costs more than you think it will. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.